Hi everyone. My name is Jordan, and this is my presentation for Psychology 10 at Pitzer. Today I'm going to talk to you about sound symbolism, which is something you probably never heard of before, but I'm going to try and show you that you actually know more about sound symbolism than you think you know. So first, let me start off with a quote from Romeo and Juliet. So Juliet says, "What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet." So sort of the idea here that Juliet is trying to convey is that the fact that we call this flower a rose, like we spell it R-O-S-E and pronounce it rose, that's just arbitrary. We could call it something else. We could call it some other name, and it would smell just as sweet as it did already. So this is the idea of arbitrariness. So arbitrariness is essentially the idea that the sounds which represent a word are arbitrary with respect to the meaning of the word itself. So a good example of this is the word dog. So like if you try to break up the word dog into its sounds like D, O, and G, there really isn't any sort of meaning that corresponds to each individual letter. So you could say that the word dog, the choice of spelling it D-O-G, is arbitrary in terms of the language. So you can also look at synonyms for dog, such as canine, hound, mutt, and pooch. And you can see that the sounds that make up those words really don't have anything in common either. And on top of that, if you look at the word for dog in other languages, you see perro, cane, hound. They don't really share any sounds in common either. So that suggests that the word dog in English is arbitrary, and likewise the word for dog in other languages is also arbitrary. We could have picked some other word, but just the fact that society has arbitrarily assigned the meaning of dog to the word dog, that's just arbitrary. We could have picked something else and everyone would know the dogs the same way. But this presentation is on sound symbolism, which is the opposite of arbitrariness. So the idea of sound symbolism is that the individual sounds in a word actually do contribute to the word's meaning. So sort of the easiest example of this to see is an onomatopoeia word. So a word like crash, boom, whoosh. The sounds of the word sort of are trying to imitate the sound itself. So like the sound whoosh is supposed to actually sound like something whooshing past you. And if you look at the onomatopoeia words in other languages, you will actually see that they are often comprised of similar sounds. So I've got phonetic transcriptions of the sound for a clock, the sound that a clock makes in other languages here, and you can see like tick-tock is actually like a pretty common saying in other languages. That suggests that this word isn't actually arbitrary, and that the sound of the word does contribute to the meaning. All right, so now I'm going to take you through some examples of sound symbolism. I've tested these before on my friends, and they've worked, so hopefully they will work on you. After I give the example, I encourage you to pause the video and test it out for yourself and see if it works on you. And if you're doing this in front of a class, I would ask you to poll the class and see if everyone agrees on the same answer. All right. So the first example is a pretty famous example. It's called the Boba and Kiki test. So what I've got here is two shapes and two names. And all you have to do is, without really thinking, just decide which name goes with which shape. So you've got Boba and Kiki. Which name goes with which shape? All right, so take a moment and think about that. Maybe pause the video. And I'm going to give you the answer that 95% of people give. Obviously, there are no wrong answers, but 95% of people ultimately say this. They say that this shape on the left, the spiky one, is Kiki, and the shape on the right that's more rounded is Boba. So why is that? So sort of the theoretical answer here is that the k sound in Kiki just sort of feels sharper to people. Likewise, the b sound in Boba feels a bit more round. And this phenomenon actually transcends languages. That is, this phenomenon doesn't just work on English speakers, it will work on people from different languages as well. So this is sort of a first example of where you can see that the sounds actually sort of do carry some meaning with them. Like the K sound, for some reason, feels sharper than the B sound. All right, let me get on to another example. So here's an experiment. You're in a spaceship approaching a planet, and you've been told there are two races on it. One is beautiful and friendly to humans, and the other is unfriendly, ugly, and mean-spirited. You've also been told that one of these groups is called the Lemonians, and the other is called the Gratoks. Which do you think is which? So again, take a second and decide. And here, most people will tell you that the Lemonians are the friendly and beautiful race, while the Gratoks are the unfriendly, ugly, and mean species. So why is that as well? Like, this has also been studied, and it's very strong. People will tend to say that the Lemonians are beautiful and friendly. The vast majority of people will do this. So sort of the explanation here is that the consonant sounds that make up Lemonians, the L, M, and N sounds, they're liquid consonants. So they don't really obstruct the airflow in the mouth. And that causes them to sound, I guess, friendlier in a sense. On the other hand, the sounds in Gratoks, the G, the T, and the K, are stop consonants, and that means they obstruct the airflow in the mouth. And that sort of has the effect of sounding harsher, whereas the liquid consonants sound smoother. And for that reason, the word with a bunch of stop consonants, which is Gratoks, will sound a bit harsher, therefore unfriendlier, uglier, and meaner. All right, so here's a third example. So I've got a couple of made-up words, and all you have to do is order them within each category from what you think would be the heaviest object to the lightest object. So let's say I've got three objects called foob, fleeb, and flab. Which one would be the heaviest? Which one would be the lightest? And similarly, you've got lot and lat. Which is the heaviest? Which is the lightest? All right, take a second to think about that. In this case, most people will say that floob and lot are the heavier objects, and fleeb and lat are the lighter objects. And this is also a very strong correlation. Most people will give this ordering as well. So what is the cause here? Because in this case, within each category, the consonants are exactly the same. The only thing that changed was the vowel sounds. So in the heavier objects, you've got the oo and the o sound. And those are back vowels, which means that they're pronounced in the back of the mouth, essentially. And on the other hand, the e and the a sound are front vowels, which means they're pronounced in the front of the mouth. So on top of that, the back vowels tend to have more low frequency sounds, and the front vowels tend to have more high frequency sounds. And as it turns out, the low frequency sounds sort of invoke sort of a heavier feeling, whereas the high frequency sounds invoke a lighter feeling. And that's what causes this ordering to be apparent. All right, so let me briefly try to explain what this has to do with introductory psychology. So if you read chapter 7 of our textbook, it discussed how psychology applies to language. And sound symbolism is inherently a psycholinguistic phenomenon. Basically, it's how our brain interprets the sounds at a phonemic level. So one thing you need to understand for the rest of this talk is what a phoneme is. So a phoneme is a perceptually distinct sound of a language which can be used to distinguish two words from each other. So for example, P and T are phonemes because they can distinguish the words pan and tan. You see that the only thing different between those words is the consonant P and T. And you know that these two words have different meanings, and therefore you can see that P and T are different phonemes. So if you take a course in linguistics, you'll see a table like this. And this is a table of all the phoneme consonants in English. So if you remember from the Grautok and Lemonian example, This table shows you that G, T, and K are stop consonants and obstruct the airflow, whereas L, M, and N are nasal and lateral approximants, which means they don't obstruct the airflow. This table essentially maps out every consonant in English, and don't worry about the fact that you probably don't understand some of these symbols. Based on where in the mouth they are articulated, as well as the manner in which the airflow is obstructed. All right, and furthermore, you will also see a table like this, which is all of the vowels in English, and these are IPA symbols. I don't expect you to know what they mean unless you've taken an linguistics course. But here you can see that the U and O are back vowels, whereas the E and A are front vowels. Like I said before, the back vowels tend to be more low frequency, and the front vowels tend to be more high frequency. So the back vowels feel heavier, and the front vowels feel lighter. So sound symbolism is actually something that's been getting a lot of attention recently. It was first sort of proposed as an explanation for language choice by Socrates, but he pretty much immediately disregarded the idea because he realized that most words were in fact arbitrary, and he sort of abandoned it. But recently, in the past 30 years, a lot of modern psycholinguistic researchers have been highly focused on sound symbolism. And here are some of the papers that I drew from for this presentation. So if you're interested, you can look these up and read them for yourself. So here's some of the common knowledge that the people researching sound symbolism know at the current moment. So research has shown that the front vowels, such as E, A, I, and A, tend to sound smaller, milder, thinner, faster, lighter, softer, friendlier, brighter, weaker, and more feminine than the back vowels. The back vowels are U, A, O, etc. And if you want to test out these words for yourself, these are ordered. These words are ordered in order of having the most front vowels to the most back vowels, and this sort of corresponds to every vowel that is in English. So you can see sort of how they are ordered, and which ones will sound more feminine, which ones will sound more masculine, if you're interested in that. On top of that, voiceless stops, so that's K, P, and T, are going to sound the sharpest, especially sharper than voiced bilabial consonants, which are pronounced with the lips, and by voicing the vocal cords, which are going to sound rounder. And finally, approximants. The examples of the approximants are M, N, W, I, R, and L. They're going to sound more liquid and friendlier than the voiceless stops. So if you look at the papers that I showed, you can find sort of mappings between groups of consonants and the sort of associations that are gained with them. Now I'd like to take a moment to sort of explain why sound symbolism even happens in the first place. And now, first off, I'd like to point out that this actually isn't really that well known at the current moment. Sound symbolism itself is still pretty controversial. I guess some people could probably make a legitimate argument that it is just a coincidence, but I don't really agree with that myself. I think there's probably some better underlying explanation. So here's 3 potential explanations of why sound symbolism occurs. I guess I don't know if any one of these is particularly like the primary explanation, but it could potentially be some of all 3. So the first explanation is synesthesia. So synesthesia is basically the idea that if you have something that affects one of your senses, sort of in your brain, you will sort of also experience that in other senses as well. So in the case of sound symbolism, your experiences of sound are going to lead to experiences in your other senses, giving you some sort of feeling. So like there could be some sort of characteristic of the K sound, which when you hear it, it invokes, like your brain interprets it and invokes some sort of sharp feeling inside of you. So a second explanation is association with known words. So the idea here is that perhaps these sounds evoke a certain feeling simply due to the fact that those sounds are present in a large number of words that carry the meaning that it is associated with. So the best example of this that I found is the GL sound, like go. And that tends to sound smooth and bright. And you could make a case that it sounds like that because of all of the words that are also that have that sort of meaning and the GL sound in them as well. So you have glow, gleam, glimmer, glare, glisten. So you could argue that perhaps maybe the association came from the words, like the words were created first, and therefore we got the association. But I guess you could also make the opposite case. Perhaps maybe the GL sound had that sort of characteristic first, and therefore these words were chosen because of the characteristic of the GL sound. Of course, more research is going to have to be done. Another example of this is the sound, which tends to invoke a round feeling, perhaps because of all of the words that have that meaning with sharing the sound, such as hump, lump, mumps, plump, rump, and stump. So there's a second potential explanation of sound symbolism. And the third explanation is that simply the place and manner, so the way that you pronounce the sounds in your mouth is actually what is contributing to the meaning. So perhaps the high frequency phonemes, like we discussed before, are just inherently more feminine sounding, and the low frequency sounds are inherently more masculine sounding because of the way we've sort of determined that low frequency stuff, like heavy stuff, is more masculine, and that high frequency stuff is more feminine. And likewise, the liquid consonants, the ones that don't obstruct the airflow, are just going to sound smoother because of the way we pronounce them, whereas the ones that block the air are going to sound harsher, again, just because of the way we pronounce them. So hopefully, as research in sound symbolism progresses, we'll have a better idea of what actually causes this phenomenon. All right, so now let me discuss some of the real-life applications of sound symbolism. So the first thing I want to talk about is sound symbolism and brand names. So some observant researchers noticed that cracker brands tend to share the same two vowels, the E and the I sound. So you look at Cheese Its, Wheat Thins, Cheese Nips, Triscuits, Ritz, Keebler. They all share the same vowels. So why is that? Why would cracker brands want to have E and I sounds in them? So sort of the sound symbolism explanation of that is that the E and the I sounds are going to sort of invoke sort of a sharp, crispy feel. And that's sort of the thing a cracker brand would want. It would want to be sharp and crispy. But on the other hand, some researchers have noticed that ice cream brands tend to have more back vowel sounds. They have the O, they have the ah, oo sounds. You look at gelato, Rocky Road, Haagen-Dazs, cookie dough. They have the back vowels. So why would ice cream brands want to have back vowels in their name? So the sound symbolism explanation is that a back vowel is more likely to evoke sort of like a rich and creamy sort of idea in the name. And that's sort of the same that an ice cream brand would want to invoke. Now, some researchers ended up doing a study where basically they gave consumers ice cream, and it was the same ice cream, but the only thing they changed was the name. One was called Frosh, and the other was called Frisch, and the consumers preferred the ice cream named Frosh. So the only thing that changed was the vowel in the name from a back vowel and to a front vowel, and the consumers preferred the back vowel, which is very interesting. It sort of suggests that even the sounds that you choose for a brand name sort of invoke meanings to the consumer like this. Even the particular sounds matter when choosing your brand name. So people who are picking brand names could look to sort of sound symbolism research to find the right consonants and vowels to evoke the right feelings from a consumer. So it's even important at a corporate level. Some more research that's been done that sort of applies to real life. Some researchers found that the phonemes in your first name can affect sort of people's perceptions of you, and they showed this by basically giving a bunch of first names and a bunch of sort of silhouettes of people, and they found that people who had like round or sharp consonants in their name, like in the Boba and Kiki study, would be more likely to be associated with sort of round or thin silhouettes. So again, it's sort of evidence that the sounds in your name carry even more meaning than previously thought. And a final real-life example of sound symbolism is Japanese ideophones. So an ideophone is basically a word where the sounds of the word contribute to the meaning, which is sort of the definition of sound symbolism again. And research has shown that constructing languages in this form using ideophones actually can make the language easier to pick up. It's easier to learn. So if you're trying to construct a language, it would be in your best interest to do research in sound symbolism and figure out how to pick the words in such a way that you can maximize the sort of making it easier to learn aspect of sound symbolism. And if you want to have some more idea of what a Japanese ideophone is, here are some Anglicized versions of Japanese ideophones. And you can test yourself and see how well the word actually conveys the meaning it tries to convey. So you can take this test, basically matching a word to an adjective, see how many you get right, and I'll have the answers in a little bit, so if you want to pause the video here. Here are the answers. I ended up getting 9 out of 10 right, so which I think is pretty unlikely to happen just by chance. Alright, so I want to wrap this presentation up by telling you about a little experiment I did. So basically, I got 6 of my friends to answer sort of the same questions that I gave you guys in this presentation, along with some extra questions. So basically, instead of looking just at heavy versus light, I also asked about masculine versus feminine, intelligent versus unintelligent, and red versus blue. And basically what I was looking at is which way they would sort the high frequency vowels, the front vowels, versus the back vowels, the low frequency vowels. So one of the papers that I read suggested that the high frequency vowels would be associated with more intelligent and feminine things. So I was curious to see if the men would be saying that the low vowels are both more masculine and unintelligent. That seems sort of like a contradiction, that a guy would say that the same words sound both more like them, like more manly, as well as more unintelligent. So I was curious to see if this phenomenon would be observable. And I guess my answer is really that I can't really tell. I only asked 6 people, so it's kind of hard to make a conclusion based on that. But I would say that doing a follow-up study on this and looking at the differences between the genders in how they are affected by sound symbolism is something that should be studied. So just a brief overview of the results that I found. Pretty much everyone said Kiki as a spiky shape, and the Lemonians were friendly. That was very strong. And then the back vowels being heavier was a very strong correlation. Pretty much everyone picked all of those correctly, or in that manner. And then the back vowels being masculine was also pretty strong. But when it came to the front vowels and intelligence, it was very even. There was a lot of sort of contradictions between people's what they said was more intelligent or not. So it was very weak. But it was slightly stronger for the women than the men, which is interesting. And then finally, the red versus blue, which was sort of supposed to act as like a control, that I was thinking people wouldn't go either way. There was actually a slight weak correlation with the front vowels, which I can't really explain that. I don't know why. Perhaps it was also just due to statistical chance. Like I said, sample size was small, but it would be interesting to see sort of this sort of scale, or this sort of survey on a larger scale. Alright, I guess that wraps up my presentation. I hope you learned something about yourself. Hopefully you learned about how you sort of have a bias towards certain consonants and certain feelings, or certain vowels and certain feelings. Hopefully you're more aware of that now. If you're interested in sound symbolism as a whole, here are some of the papers that I looked at. And you can do some Google searches and find more resources online. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. Alright, thank you.